Aloha. Well, here we are again. Yes, I have changed my position on the property because the neighbor's nonstop with a chainsaw over there today, and the sound was bouncing in. So we have taro and avocados and vanilla behind me today instead of coffee and vanilla. Well, I had a request from one of the viewers. They live in Zone 6. I think they said BC, Canada. And they wanted to know if I'd talk about gardening in different climate zones. Well, just like when I was requested to talk about nursery work, I feel I'm qualified. Yeah, well, when it comes to talking about different climate zones, well, I haven't lived or grown in every one of them, but the spread has been from one end to the other. You know, I've planted gardens and successfully in Homer, Alaska. I have a long history of actual nursery production and food production in northern Wisconsin, Zone 3, which is a pretty cold climate. It's a pretty cold climate. Most of you live in places much milder than that, actually. Well, I started gardening in Illinois. I'm in Zone 5, a little bit maybe in some Zone 6, but mostly in Zone 5 in Illinois, which is a marvelous gardening zone, by the way. And to you in Zone 6, you got the best. You get the best of all worlds, frankly, as far as I'm concerned. Some areas have distinct advantages, you know, in the way their climates are. But I think Zones 5, Zone 6, these are zones where so many different crops cross over. Oh, my goodness. You can grow peaches, but you can grow blueberries, you can grow tomatoes, you can grow pumpkins, you can grow corn, you can grow soybeans, sweet potatoes, peanuts. You can grow... with a little care, and consideration, you can grow darn near anything but tropical crops. You won't be doing any subtropicals or tropicals, but anything else, it's wide open. And generally that zone, at least in the mainland United States, that also contains some of our finest soils, too. Mostly zones 4 through 6 have some of the richest soils that we see naturally deposited. Association to the prairie wars and the ice age mostly is what caused these great soils. But I've gardened in Arizona, in Phoenix, and it's quite hot. The problem in Phoenix is heat, absolutely. I've spent many years in California. Illinois, Wisconsin, Alaska, Arizona, California, now Hawaii. I've kind of missed the middle strip of the country a little bit, I guess. But otherwise, I've seen both ends. The main thing about climate, I guess, and gardening zones is... understand what zone you are in. That's important. And then tend to try to tailor your activities so that they match that sort of a climate zone. Just because people in California are doing one thing doesn't mean you can do the same thing in Duluth, Minnesota. It isn't going to happen, most likely. And so as you take a look at, what are your frost-free dates, typically? When does frost usually end? When does frost usually reoccur? How frequently do you get frost out of that period, too? That's important. What's your winter lows? And on average, there's a whole lot of crops out there that I miss out on living here in Hawaii because they need cold weather. Without what we call winter chill, they won't grow. Apples, pears, pawpaws, a whole lot of things that need to, even chirimoyas, which are a subtropical fruit. They're hit and miss here in Mountain View because they need some cold temperature in the winter. They don't like freezing temperature, but they need some cold. That's a very narrow climate adaptation on that particular crop. In the U.S., I think higher elevation here in Hawaii or some of the coastal strand in California is probably the best place for that crop. Anyway, understanding what zone you're in, what are its limitations, and then when you're trying to decide what am I growing here, well, if the apple trees you're looking at will not tolerate temperatures below 20 below zero, you don't want to go planting them in zone 3, I'll tell you that. They'll all die. Now, not all apple trees, for instance, are created equal, and this is very important when you're in different zones, because there are apple trees that will grow in Florida. There are apple trees that will grow in northern Minnesota. There are even a few apple trees that will grow in Alaska. I have several apple trees here in Hawaii. Now, they are really a fool's venture, and I'll get to that later. But there's an apple tree that's suitable for most places. There are other problems, like Arizona isn't good for them really because the heat is terrible and it'll cook your apples right in the skin. Better place for citrus. Figuring out what your limitations are by climate and then trying to adapt the cultivars and varieties that you're using to fit into that. Seed Savers Exchange, I know, had a publication, whether it still exists or not, fruit, nut, and berry inventory. I happen to have one here in the library, and it lists all of the fruits that are available commercially, and it has the descriptions for where these are at, where they came from. It's quite detailed. If the book still exists out there with Seed Savers Exchange, it's certainly worth having. The fruit, nut, and berry inventory. I used it a lot in trying to guide myself as far as fruit plants were concerned. Berries, fruit trees. There are great garden reference books that also help with some of this stuff. The Sunset Western Garden book is definitely useful on the western side of the United States of America. And that also, I believe, it extends into the climate that's in British Columbia to some extent, too. It's got the most detailed climate mapping. It's far beyond the USDA. They'll take one USDA zone and break it down into 4 or 5. It's very detailed mapping. And that helps, too. Because you can be in a given area, like I lived in the town of Fremont, for instance, in California for many years. The town of Fremont has 4 complete garden zones in Sunset. Okay, it actually has a few garden zones by USDA too, because Fremont had stuff where it would snow up on top of the peaks. But then the slopes had cold air drainage where subtropicals just thrived because the cold air fell down to the valleys in the winter and frost wouldn't settle. Then they had the valley floor. That's where I lived and where the nursery was at. And it get reasonably cold. We get a little bit of frost now and then, but not so much. Couldn't grow lemons, avocados, limes, and a few types of bananas. Frosts were minor. But then you had Zone 17 Sunset, which is maritime, too, because as you get right on San Francisco Bay, then you got this watery climate, where you can smell the ocean every day and stuff. And you get more fog and all that. And it tends to stay cooler than it does in other locations. So, even that one town actually had 4 distinct climate zones within it. So this can get pretty detailed, and sometimes you just figure things out by what works and what doesn't work in your given area. But I highly recommend starting out choosing plants that are well suited to where you're at. I know everybody wants to dream, and these days I hear so many dreamers because I have people, in Cincinnati and places contacting me for tropical fruit seeds. Now, certainly I'll sell them to you, and I hope you have fun with them and all that, but your chances of success, no. That's what I call space station gardening. And so I think all good gardeners stretch the climate zone a bit. We all do. But there's limits. When you're in a temperate zone, growing tropical plants is really very much out of the question unless you happen to own a large greenhouse, in a coal mine to heat it with or something. Yeah, I know a guy in Ohio who's got a gas well. They went to put in water well, and what they ended up with was natural gas. So he put in acres of greenhouses, and I guess he buys his bottled water, but he heats the greenhouses for free with the gas. So, you got a situation like that. Yeah, you go ahead, grow bananas, grow bananas in Ohio. But most of us, that's not the situation. Now, climate modification is, it's part of gardening, I'd like to say, no, just go out there and plant the tomatoes after the frost-free date and harvest them before the fall frost comes and put them in jars and give up on it. But that isn't the way it works for most of us. We want to stretch our climate a bit. We want to try to get a little bit on one end and a little bit on the other, and some of us want to get even way more than that, But so I want to talk a little bit about climate stretching, alrighty? And so I don't need to do too much of it here in Hawaii. Mostly Hawaii is the best weather on the planet. And so the climate doesn't usually tax us much here. I can do things that guys in the mainland need a greenhouse for, and I just do it right here in the backyard on a table. Guys in California are irrigating like crazy to keep anything growing, but we don't really need to irrigate here much either. So Hawaii's climate, at least eastern Hawaii, Puna, is one that will make you lazy. Yes, I used to be very aggressive and particular in my gardening practices. There were rules. Since I moved here, there ain't too many of them left. I plant stuff upright. Put the roots down, put the top up. You don't necessarily even have to plant it. Sometimes you just throw it here, and it takes. It's that easy on plants that are well adapted. Here it is. Anyway, not everything is adapted. But anyway, I don't have to modify climate much these days, but the main tool in my opinion is this here wire. This is grape wire. It's sometimes known as telephone wire. That's how we got it in Wisconsin. We used to have miles of this stuff because they took down the telephone lines that had been all over the area and then buried them. And when they did that, there was miles of this stuff in the dump. Here in Hawaii, I have to buy it. But this is a rigid steel wire. It's sort of tempered. It's zinc plated so it doesn't rust. And so it's springy and it's pretty stiff. It's hard to bend, okay? Using this wire, you can create all manner of different sorts of contraptions. But the main ones are to turn it into a croquet hoop, push it down in the soil in your garden, and then either run agribon, like this stuff here, over the top of it, or you run regular poly, regular clear poly. What that does is it will create a kind of a mini greenhouse. And so it's cheaper and easier than any other method I've ever run across. When I worked in window production in northern Wisconsin, we always had lots and lots and lots of windows around that were scrap from the works where, they'd measured it wrong or whatever happened. And so we get pallets full of insulated windows. Well, I would take those, and I would take huge timbers from the old barns that have been broad axe hewn, great big 6x6s and stuff. So I would take my rototiller and I would run it across my garden, and I'd till the soil nicely. I'd add fertilizers and compost and the usual amendments. Then I would take some large timbers and put them on either side of that as a bed. Then I would lay storm windows window panes on top of it and make these long greenhouses that I could grow tomatoes and peppers and things under as transplants in spring. Well, most of us don't have access to a window factory, and most of us don't have access to huge broadaxe hewn timbers from old barns like I used to use there. But using the wire with a covering like this, and then plain old spring clothespins will hold everything together. And so if you want to start your crops early, you can do it this way. Another thing to consider with climate, and its color. This right here is a black plastic pot. It's hot. It is hot to the touch. It's because black is all colors, and so it absorbs the energy of the sun, and it bounces back out as infrared radiation. And so this thing is warm. Now, if you live in a place where the climate is cold, generally, if you put things in black plastic containers so they're elevated above the ground and the sun strikes the container, the soil will be much warmer than it was, in the flat earth. This is a big issue. Soil temperature is sometimes far more important than air temperature. I mean, if you get a frost, obviously it's going to ruin your tomatoes. All right, so the air temperature is important there. But soil temperature is almost more critical. For instance, when I lived in northern Wisconsin, spring would come on with a fury. It would be in winter one day. All of a sudden, overnight, all the darn snow would melt. It'd run everywhere. We'd get a thunderstorm, and man, spring would be there. The fields would open up. And within a few weeks, the soil temperature would rise up to the point where you could begin to plant corn. Now, when I lived in California, next to the ocean, well, for one, that Pacific Ocean is one heck of a flywheel. It takes the winter cold and it keeps it rolling in the area because of the water temperature. Long after the soil would be, say, warmer in northern Wisconsin in June than it would be where I lived in the Bay Area, because we had soils that were heavier, denser, had more clay in them, more silt. The Wisconsin soils had more sand, and the sand would warm up faster in the spring. And the ocean would keep those dense soils near the bay colder for, well, sometimes even a month beyond when in Zone 3 in northern Wisconsin they were warm enough to plant tomatoes. In Zone 9 near San Francisco Bay, it was still a little bit cold depending on where you were living. It's true. Yeah, these things are very specific to certain localities. And what happens in the climate zones cannot be spoken for in general across the board. And so I can't really speak in anything but generalities on this subject, because Zone 6 is actually a whole lot of climate zones, frankly. But, yeah, like I say, if you live somewhere where it's cool, using black containers raised above the soil with light soil medias in them will speed growth. You can take a tomato, put it in a tub maybe almost a month ahead of the frost-free date in some areas, put a tomato cage in there, and then take some plastic or Remake and wrap it around the cage, take some clothespins, clip it in place, and you're set. You actually got yourself a little greenhouse with the heater underneath. And, now, the reverse is true, though, when you're somewhere where it gets really hot, like Arizona. In Arizona, if I had any flower pots around, I'd be whitewashing them, because you can get root death when the pot overheats in the sun. And so having a white container that reflects light in a desert heat-type climate is better. It's better. Now, I was talking about Agribon, or I used the word Remake. They're two brand names. This stuff is an extruded polyester that's like gauze. Air goes right through it, water goes right through it, light goes right through it. I use it here for pest barriers. This will keep birds off. This can keep insects off of a crop, But In other places, there are heavier gauges of this. It comes in different grades, and the heavier grades can be used to prevent frost. Really heavy grades can wrap a tropical plant up, so maybe it'll get through a subtropical winter, You can, if you're really doing space station gardening, you can take Remake, set it up around a plant, and then you can go ahead and put a string of Christmas tree lights on the inside, put it on a light timer, and have them turn on after dark. Then you get the heat from the light bulbs on the inside of your cover. Who knows? Maybe you can take an orange tree through the winter in Seattle that way. I don't know. They used to use that in the Bay Area on their hibiscus and the bougainvilleas and that. They'd use Christmas tree lights. Now, Remake or Agrabah, it's a sort of fuzzy, fibrous type material that actually can touch foliage. It's better if it doesn't, but it can lay directly on a plant without freezing through. But if you're using clear plastic, that stuff's deadly if it touches the leaf. It's great if you keep it suspended above the leaves. Also remember that when the sun comes up during the day, if things are completely covered up under plain poly, it becomes a solar oven. And so you can begin to cook your stuff. My partner Ellen cooked a bunch of tillandsia seedlings the other day because she just didn't realize the power of the sun when you've got a sealed container. Cooked everything. Yeah, so now when I lived in northern Wisconsin in Zone 3, and we had a good soil, a nice sandy loam soil, excellent quality stuff. We had a good soil for growing melons, but we had a terrible climate for it. It was too short. The growing season was too short. It was fairly cool. So to get a crop of melons up, I'd do as I said. I'd till the row. I'd prepare it. I'd probably be as much as 2 weeks ahead of the frost-free date sometimes. And I do the same thing for eggplants too. After it was tilled, I would take black poly and lay a strip of black poly on top of the soil down the row. Then take my wire hoops, push it in there. They'd hold the black poly down. And then, in turn, I would put clear polyethylene over the top. I would then, on both ends of the tunnel, I'd gather it and use a clothespin and just close it. During the day, I'd ungather it, roll it up, clip it so the tunnel was open and the air could pass through. Then I just cut little X's in the black poly in there and stick my melon plants or my egg plants, in there. So they were growing on top of black poly, which heated the soil quite a few degrees above what it would naturally have been at that time. The covering kept the air so that it was warmer around the plants and would keep the frost from forming on top of them if it got cold at night. Eventually, I'd pull the plastic sheet off the top and just let them ramble, all right? But, for maybe as much as a month in the early part of the year, that's what I do to get the melons going. Work with eggplants. I work real good with some of the peppers and things, too. It's really trick. Colors, man, colors. Yeah. You ever had a black Cadillac and locked a black poodle on the inside and went in shopping at Walmart in the middle of July in Georgia? You know what I'm talking about. If you live in the milder areas of the West Coast, you can have greenhouses that are unheated and do an awful lot with them. But as you get into colder areas, I've always had greenhouses. Everywhere I've lived, I've always had some sort of a structure like that. I have one here even. Here it's to keep water off. It keeps the rain off. But otherwise, the passive solar greenhouse is really trick. Now, they're kind of expensive because it takes a lot of material to make one. You need lots of insulation. You need plenty of glazing. They're heavier duty type structures, but basically, if they're earth sheltered, if the soil inside and under the greenhouse is insulated, in the case of mine, walls were insulated on the north, on the top, and on the west wall, because the north and the west winds were the coldest ones. And so I had no glazing in those areas and very thick 6-inch insulation. Underneath the building, I dug out, went down 3 feet, and I lined everything with styrofoam. So it was like a styrofoam cooler. Then I backfilled it with compost and soil. I built my tables in there and put my paths in and so forth. And I had triple glazing on the east side of the building and on the south side of the building. And the door was on the east edge because that was where the milder weather came from. Don't put the door on the west side because the cold winds will come in when you walk in. But I had 3 layers of glazing in there, and I could actually raise lettuce and spinach and a few other green vegetables even in the middle of February in northern Wisconsin, where we would have temperatures that dropped to 30, 40 below sometimes. But it would work in there. I had tanks of water painted black. I was using the square institutional steel grease cans for the fryer grease in the restaurants. They were saving them for me, and I just bring them home, fill them up full of water, paint them black, and I stacked them up all along the north wall so the sun would come in and hit those tanks of water during the day. And even in the middle of winter, they never froze solid. Now, in January, if I shook the cans, I could hear an ice block in there, but they would never freeze solid. Amazing, huh? No heater. Even at 30 below zero, they would not freeze solid inside that structure. So, color, thermal mass, I didn't mention that, right? Yeah, thermal mass, that's how passive solar works. You get enough mass. Water is mass. Soil is mass, water strips heat out of air 25 times faster out of surfaces that 25 times faster than air does. And so if you had like a solar fan and you're taking the hot air from the peak of your structure and you're blowing it with a fan, so you're ducting it underneath the soil through tiles, then you're pushing the hottest temperature of the building through the coldest temperature of the building, and so you'll get better exchange that way. There's all kinds of things you can do with this, but I still highly advocate planting what it is that actually thrives in the area where you're at, rather than constantly trying to push the envelope on stuff. Yes, when you're expanding the climate a bit, you may find you can grow a variety of tomato you weren't able to, and it comes out really good. You may find, like I did, that I could grow cantaloupes and watermelons really well. And they came out really good. The quality was excellent. I used short season varieties and all that, but using a little modification, and I could get a really decent crop out of it. But, other things, I don't know how much the trouble it's worth. People, Bill, you grow papayas and dragon fruit. And I go, you guys can have cherries, Oh man, if I had my 50 varieties of apples back that I grew in California, It's like that. So be happy with the climate zone that you live in, make the most of it, and learn all about it. And find your microclimates, South side of a building is always going to be a warmer place. North side of a building is always going to be a cooler place, and so on. Well, I'm going to cut it for there. I've been yakking long enough. Hopefully I left something along the line that's going to help somebody. Hang loose.